Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Power Center event. I'm James P. Barbieri, Associate Program Director here at the Power Center, and I will be your host for today. So any problems, technical or not, feel free to just drop me a message in the chat. Before we begin, I'd just like to very briefly go through a couple of rules for this call. First of all, if you could please mute your microphone during the presentation, just to ensure good quality audio, but at the same time, we'd encourage you all to turn on your cameras, as it's much better to talk to faces rather than blank screens. During Q&A and discussion, if you want to ask a question, you can either use the raise your hand function, which can be found on the bottom of your screen under reactions, physically raise your hand, or write your question in the chat and I can read it out for you. And yes, finally, the session is recorded for archival purposes and for you all. The recording should be available in about 3 days on YouTube, so feel free to share this recording. So yes, now we can begin. Today we introduce Alex Gomez-Marin, theoretical physicist turned cognitive neuroscientist. He received his PhD in physics at the University of Barcelona and has been a researcher at the Center for Genomic Regulation and at the Champalimaud Center for the Unknown. Alex is currently the head of the Behavior of Organisms Laboratory at the Instituto de Neurosciences, where he is trying to establish neuroethological principles across species. Today, he will be talking about the consciousness of neuroscience. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Alex. Welcome.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be participating in this community that I don't know yet. So hopefully during the discussion, I'll get a better feeling as to what's going on and the interests and the sensibilities. So we have a couple of hours. It can be shorter. That depends how it goes. I plan to present without slides and for about 40 minutes. But I'm happy to be interrupted. So feel free. I mean, if I'm interrupted too much and I cannot keep on with the flow of what I want to say, well, maybe we'll see. But I'm happy being interrupted, and I have a lot of things to tell you. I would also like to have enough discussion time so that we can dwell on certain points or clarify or critique my very own critique. All right, so I entitled this talk, The Consciousness of Neuroscience, which is in a way in contrast with the neuroscience of consciousness. And so, as you'll see, the spirit of it, drawing back from Kennedy's famous quote, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So in a way, I'm asking not how neuroscience can explain consciousness or how we could do so, but in a way, I'm turning it around and saying how being more conscious as to what we're doing in neuroscience can better help us. So let us start, because I don't know your backgrounds and what you read and what you usually do, and as academics sometimes tend to take some things for granted. I'll go through some basic remarks at the beginning, but I'm also feel free to fast forward me if at some point that's already taken for granted. So let me just say a couple of things. So the field of consciousness, the scientific study of consciousness, not so long ago, a few decades, was career suicide. Meaning you couldn't do it because if you did it, like people would look really strange at you and your students would not get grants. And so basically it was taboo to study consciousness. And that started to change in the 90s. Of course, psychologists have been interested in consciousness throughout the 20th century, but that started to change in part thanks to, you could say, the humble hubris of Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA. You could say, after solving the secret of life, and for those who are only hearing the audio, I'm doing quotations with my fingers because well, maybe it's too big of a claim, but after solving the secret of life, he said, well, maybe we can dare to solve consciousness. And he's, together with Christoph Koch, was a very pragmatic, you could say reductionist and materialist approach, which are the things I'll critique today, but I think it's fair to say that thanks to this impetus, well, consciousness research took on in the 90s. And today, paradoxically, consciousness is not taboo, but what perhaps is taboo is the type of explanations we can give about consciousness especially from a neuroscientific point of view. I mean, my feeling, being a physicist, but also a neuroscientist and really interested in consciousness, is that, well, unless you're a materialist, it's really hard to do neuroscience of consciousness, and we'll see why. Another thing that's worth remarking about the history of the study of consciousness is that those decades ago, when consciousness was so difficult to study, well, there was this feeling. I mean, I'm old, but I'm young enough not to have lived that feeling. But I've spoken to people that have been studying consciousness for decades, and there was this feeling of doing something, secret and dangerous. So you could say that, speaking in engineering terms, the signal was very small, but it was a powerful signal. Like, people that were doing it were really into it. Today, on the other hand, consciousness it's in its heyday, and that means that maybe the noise, not the signal, is very high, because everybody wants to say things about consciousness. Well, that lecture today is an example of it. I myself want to say some things about consciousness, and it really captures the imagination of lay people, as it should, and it's getting considerable research funding, and it's selling a lot of books. All right, so I would have entitled this talk, "What is it like to be a materialist studying consciousness?" The famous, what it is like to be a bat. So really, what it is like to be a materialist studying consciousness today. And to straight away tell you my position, I will argue that the hard problem of consciousness is ill-posed. So what's the hard problem of consciousness? Well, so let me quote Chalmers, who in the 90s, again, wrote, posed it like that. Of course, it's the mind-body problem has been there forever, but Chalmers formulated it in a very particular way, and he wrote the following, which is very interesting to unfold what I want to do today. He asked, why should physical processing give rise, and this word is very important to me, why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? And then he continues, it seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. You see, short sentence, there's a lot to unpack here. Why should physical processing give rise to rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. So what does he mean by yet it does? So does it really, like, is the claim that physical processing gives rise to consciousness really an empirical fact? Because as Chalmers says it here, he's a philosopher, but perhaps he's drawing from science. It seems like it is. It's an empirical fact. Or maybe it's a metaphysical commitment that is covered, hidden, and perhaps that's precisely the metaphysical commitment, the philosophical commitment that one would want to openly examine. And I think it's a fool's errand, this commitment that's pursued, and that's the paradox. Sorry for the one should warm up the voice, I learned before talking. Okay, so you see, this commitment is embraced, knowingly or not, by so many intelligent people, scientists and philosophers. So it's paradoxical, and hopefully the discussion, you can also help illuminate my understanding as to, why so many intelligent people believe things that I think are so stupid. To put it bluntly, right? And probably I'm the stupid here, but in any case, I'm thinking aloud and I share it with you. So that's the hard problem of consciousness, right? And how is it that brain makes consciousness? And well, again, perhaps we should go back to the mind-body problem, because already the hard problem of consciousness is phrased in a way that's tricky. Imagine it's like when an interviewer makes you a tricky question, right? Like, he could say, or she could say, well, why did you hit that car with your car? And say, no, wait, I didn't hit the car. So I don't want to answer your question. I want to question your question because I think there's something in it that doesn't make sense, right? Or even like a clever prosecutor, right? So let's inquire, instead of asking how is that miracle happening, right? Let's inquire about the nature of the relation between brain and consciousness, or body and mind, right? Instead of trying to figure out, which is what most neuroscientists studying consciousness, I would say, are trying to do, which is, well, find the mechanism that would ultimately explain how that happens. Now, let me quote one of my favorite philosophers, Henri Bergson. And he says in his book Matter and Memory in 1896, so 125 years ago, right? This is amazing. So he says that there is a close connection between a state of consciousness and the brain we do not dispute, nor do I dispute. I think nobody disputes it, right? But then he says, but there is also a close connection between a coat and the nail on which it hangs. For if the nail is pulled out, the coat falls to the ground. Shall we say then that the shape of the nail gives us the shape of the coat, or in any way corresponds to it, right? So if you imagine that consciousness is somehow hung up on the brain, sure, if we screw up the brain, consciousness is screwed up, right? It can even disappear, of course. Now, what does that really tell you? Because that's perhaps really the summary of the only empirical evidence we have, I would say 100 years later. What does that really tell you about, again, their relationship? It's not to take for granted. Now, there's the hard problem. Recently, Anil Seth has put forth what he calls the real problem, and it's a way of making the hard problem a bit more doable by saying, well, let's not ask this question as to how or why this kind of incredible feat that brains make consciousness happen. Let's just do a bit of business as usual, what materialists love to do, which is progress in their own area. And it's, well, here we have phenomenological properties, right? First person properties of experience. And let's find out mechanisms, biological mechanisms that can account or explain for that. But again, that's not really tackling the juicy problem, which is that in the world we see objects and we believe those objects are material, and that matter is basically defined as that which doesn't have mind. So basically those things are out there, but at the same time we have experience, and then we think, well, there's a very special object, which is our brain. How is our brain creating this experience, right? That's the hard problem. So this is a way to, in a way, bypass it or dissolve it. But as I'll argue later, this is a good example of promissory materialism, which is, well, all these problems will eventually in the future get solved. Let's just keep on doing our business. Let's not examine our presuppositions. Let's just keep on doing our work like, diligent, clever technicians, and eventually we will reveal all the mysteries, right? So in a nutshell, what I want to do, or what I'm doing already today, is I want to make the questioning of the question a legitimate one to ask. So I want to give space, and maybe that's why the Paris Center is giving me this space. Within neuroscience, is it possible to raise your hand and say, sorry, the hard problem, the question you're asking is already ill-defined, right? So instead of asking how brain makes consciousness, I want to ask today whether it does, right? So this is very important, and it happens in science when people confuse scientific facts with philosophical commitments, right? Especially if those commitments are false and not recognized as even being commitments. And let me also say, I'm not going to promise any holy grail. My talk is not going to be like, okay, I mount a position and then I offer you my ism. My ism, because there are so many isms: materialism, panpsychism, idealism. There's so many isms. They're interesting. We'll go briefly through them. But I think the solution to the hard problem is not the solution, actually. And that's something interesting to discuss later, I think. Okay. So what about philosophical arguments? Well, there are all these isms, this landscape of isms. If I can joke, it's a bit like sometimes this is like too much of intellectual jousting, all these egos fighting like two horses and two lancets, and let's see which one wins, like in Mad Max, two get in and one comes out. Well, let's take it a bit easy, right? But let's go through my take on different ways of being a materialist, because it is not already obvious by what I've said so far and by the abstract. Let me say it again. I think the problem with the hard problem is materialism itself. So there's one way of being a materialist, which is, or sometimes materialist is rephrased into the word physicalist, because if you believe everything is material, well, it's not just material, there's energy, right? Physicists have known this for many, many years. So a better way to call it is physicalism. And physicalists believe that mental processes can be explained entirely in terms of physics, right? So they believe that the physical world is closed. This is a technical term, which means, well, that's what it is. And the world of experiences derivate from the physical world, much like smoke from fire. And that smoke cannot act on the fire. So then this leads all these mental processes, which is not an abstraction. It's like being consciousness, it's being painful, and having pain, and tasting water and feeling how wet it is, you know? All of those things, which is our everyday life, those things are hanging like some sort of smoke that it's not really real, right? It's quite weird. Now, there are varieties of materialism or physicalism, right? The strongest one is radical physicalism or eliminativism, like it eliminates. So here we have the mind-body problem. How can we solve the mind-body problem? Well, we just mutilate one part of it. So what should we kill? We kill the mind. So end of the story. That's the solution. The mind does not exist. And then, well, it's a simple solution, and that's powerful. But then what we wanted to explain in the first place is gone, and not even gone. It's like it doesn't really exist. So it's really a strange position, but it's embraced by many people. Usual reactions, because that's interesting also when you experience what people, if you happen to have this discussion, let's say I go to a conference with neuroscientists, and in the coffee break or at night, you know, when we a couple of glasses of wine and everybody's a bit more relaxed, you know, by the way, in neuroscience, we just, you know, tune in with coffee, and then get loose with alcohol. Well, like all humans, right? It's interesting with respect to states of consciousness, why we don't use other substances. But in any case, well, so let's say you're taking wine and you're more relaxed, and you can have a discussion about these things. So if you criticize materialism, especially of this sort, like the radical one, you can get this typical knee-jerk responses. So one would be, so are you a dualist? Sorry? to which I'll reply, well, perhaps, and I think Jaron Lanier has argued, and very honestly, that perhaps being a dualist is an honest position, a temporary one, but maybe it's an honest position, and there's sophisticated ways of being a dualist. To say, well, there's mind and there's body, and well, we need to figure out how they interact. Like a very sophisticated way is to be a dual aspect monism. Like there's monism, there's one thing, but it has two sides, like a coin. One is mind and the other is matter. Of course, there's a lot of explaining to do there, but that's just to say that, well, an easy reaction is, so you're a dualist, and then the reaction to the reaction is, well, things are not so tricked, right? And a nice metaphor makes this very visual. If you have a magnet, you have a north pole and a south pole of the magnet. Now, if you cut the magnet, you don't get rid of the north pole, because now that you have two magnets, each one having a north and a south pole. So it's not so inconceivable that there could be two things that are emerging from one underlying reality. Another reaction, if you criticize materialism, is, so you are a mystic? And to me, that's not an insult, but very interestingly, announcing this talk on Twitter last week, somebody replied and said, aha, Alex, gotcha, neuroscientist, theoretical physicist, but at the end, at the bottom, you're a mystic, right? so we'll see what this means also later. It's very interesting that that's used as an insult, but it's very typical. If you're not a materialist, there has to be something spooky, you know, even religious also used as derogatory, or even mystic. And then there's another one. So it's like, well, if you don't embrace such a simple solution, right? There's just one thing, we mutilate the other one, we say mind doesn't exist. Well, people invoke Occam's razor. You've heard of Occam's razor, right? It's this idea that, well, if you have two competing explanations, pick the simplest. But people always forget the continuation of the sentence is, if both are all else being equal. If you have two equal things and one is simpler than the other, pick the simpler. But if you have two things and they are different, just picking the simpler, it's perhaps not a good idea. Maybe it's more like naive simplicity. So I'm just already advancing some of the reactions one would hear as to my critique. Then there's another sort of materialism that's having a very interesting revival today. I'm a bit more sympathetic to it. It's called panpsychism. Pan everywhere, psychism, psyche, mind. So what does it say? Well, it accepts the world of mind as part of the world of matter. So in the first case, in this radical materialism, was more like, well, end of the story. Here for panpsychism there's another side of the story. It's like there's also mind, and they say in the recent revival that mind is a fundamental property. Realize that, well, it's fundamental, but it's a property, like charge or mass, you see. And in any case, the interesting thing to note here is that then mind and matter would go in parallel, like brain and consciousness. It's like, well, they both get to live in the same house without killing each other. Now there's another ism, epiphenomenalism. Well, it's like, let's not go too much into this, but well, yes, some mental stuff goes with physical processes. So here you see that these are just ways of conciliating mind and body, or matter and consciousness, right? And then there are other types of theories that are more identitarian. They make this identity and a metaphor to understand that. So they say, well, mind and brain, well, they're not identical in a logical sense, like triangles or numbers. It's not 2 equals 2, but it's more like, they put this example, like Venus, which we can call it the evening star, it's getting dark. And we also call it the morning star. So then those would be alternative names to give to the same thing. So there's a kind of equivalent. So you see, I think really the core of the matter here is what type of relationship do we have? And we are usually scientists, neuroscientists, I don't know why, we're not usually very precise about what type of relationship. Again, we take for granted that it just somehow emerged somewhere in the brain, but there are many types of relationship. It can be of equivalence, it can be like parallel, it can be in solidarity, like this example I was putting of the code at the pin that's hanging from it. So, well, so basically, summary, many materialists, if they had the universe in Microsoft Word, they would find the word subjective experience and they would do replace all and they would write brain process, right? So that's the deal. Wherever you have subjective experience, you could replace for brain process, ultimately, maybe not today, but in the future. Brain process sometimes also the body, right? Now, this has to do with the first sort of arguments I wanted to discuss, like philosophical. But then there's a second batch of sources to discuss this, which is simply experience, right? First person experience. Me, myself, trying to describe, realize what am I experiencing? And that's called phenomenology. Phenomenology is the study of phenomena, but in its more technical sense, it means doing this introspection, if you wish, this inner work of realizing, well, actually, if I'm trying to explain experience, consciousness, well, that's happening within me. Well, maybe I can go inside. Maybe I don't need to, outsource it to some machine measuring some other human or some other animal's brain. I can do it with my own mind, right? And I think this is a very powerful track, but for some reason it hasn't really taken off. I think it hasn't taken off. Well, the historical reasons, like when it started to kick off in the West, in Europe, with William James, well, then behaviorism happened, and the world wars happened, and all those efforts were put to a halt. It's a historical strange fact that these things happen, and it was put to a halt. Of course, in the East, they've been doing this forever, and perhaps we should, and that's at the end, perhaps we should go back to Eastern tradition. And this has been happening, of course, in the West, through Buddhism primarily, but again, doing what's called contemplative practices through the mind, be more precise about what's there, and then maybe you can use third-person methods of science. Now, let me just say something that's super simple but really cool. Like, also in the East, they say we have four ways to write knowledge, which doesn't mean that with those methods, with these ways, we get absolute truth, but right knowledge. One is precisely direct experience, but we're constantly recommended to distrust, distrust our senses. We're constantly reminded that we're fooled constantly and stupid, so don't trust your senses, which is true, they're illusions, but it's more like, it's a bit, not just paranoid, but well, self-destructive, because if we doubt so much our own experience, then what else do we have? Well, there's a second way, right way to knowledge, which is logic or inference. But that's also a sword that needs to be, worked out. Then there's comparison and analogy. And we do this a lot of neuroscience. And funny enough, we do it too much because we say, well, the brain is a computer, and we always forget the word, the brain is like a computer. So everybody chooses their own favorite metaphor. It often is the metaphor of the technology of the day. And again, we forget that's a metaphor, and then we get into trouble discussions. Some discussions are fruitful, others are dead ends. So we have direct experience, logic and inference, comparison or analogy, and then verbal testimony. That's also very interesting. Verbal testimony can be scripture or the claims of experts, right? And that's very important to those of you who are not experts or who are not neuroscientists, because what should you do? Should you believe what they say? Of course, we should take experts really seriously because they've been studying it. But what if they're wrong, right? So that's why it's really important to have these four ways pretty balanced. So if we shut down our confidence in our own experience, and we're not very good with logic, and we use analogies in a very naive way, and we trust experts who have many conflicts of interest most of the time, we are not in good shape. Okay, now let me move into the more experimental and logical part that has to do with neuroscientific data. So I've talked a bit so far about the philosophical isms. Now I just made this point about the importance of experience and phenomenology. I'm going quickly, but I have more to cover, and we have time, so I'll not get nervous. But let's talk about now the experiments, the third-person neuroscientific empirical data. And for this, I need to introduce, maybe some of you know, but I was saying Francis Crick and Christoph Koch in the 90s brought this idea, this very pragmatic idea. How are we going to study consciousness? Well, to begin with, we're not going to study consciousness. We're going to study visual awareness. So we're going to present some interesting but simplified cases, like rivalry between a figure, in one side or the other, something very simple visually, and we're going to try to measure neural correlates. So in a way that something happening in the brain correlates with something that has to do with experience. So let's say if you have the experience of whatever, right? In the lab is something simple, but let's say experience of, of being in pain or smelling good coffee. Well, there has to be somewhere in your brain where some activity is taking place, right? So that could be a start. Now, this is just correlation. And we know this sentence, correlation does not imply causation. But even if you had causation, and what would causation be? Well, that's called necessity and sufficiency claims. What is that? Well, so here you have, so it's a switch. So basically you turn something off. In your brain. I mean, you can do it in animals. Of course, in humans, it's not ethical. Not to say that in animals it's totally ethical either, but you understand what I mean, right? So you turn something off in the brain, you cut a piece of brain if you're, very bold, or you do it very sophisticated. You can do it with light today. So you turn it off, and then let's imagine that you turn off a part of your brain, like the switch, click, and then some conscious experience also disappears. Of course, if you do it in an animal, you need to figure out how the animal tells you without telling you. In a human, you could ask. Now, if now you turn this part of the brain on, and then you can induce that experience, you would say, well, I don't have here correlation, I have causation, because that brain region is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. But again, if I can make an analogy, imagine you have a TV set, you cut the cable, it could be the power cable, it could be any other cable, and the image disappears, and now you're skilled enough to fix it, and then you fix it, and the image comes back. Yes, you have causality, not just correlation. So you're better off than the neural correlates. You have causality, but does that mean that cable generates the image, or that the content of the image is in that cable? Or maybe just that it's a necessary part and it's sufficient for you to activate it. But of course, you need the internet, and you need many more bits and many more parts, right? To have that image on your screen, right? So that's just to say that this motto, that's no brain, never mind, I would say, we need to be careful, no brain, never mind, because first of all, what about plants? What about other kingdoms of life? Now there's a resurgence of the study of learning, cognition, mind, even consciousness in other kingdoms of life that are not animals, right? Why not? We should be at least open, right? And that's also fascinating because some scientists deny consciousness to plants or even quote unquote lower animals, simpler animals, but they're so excited to confer consciousness to algorithms and machines. You know, maybe there's something there that's a bit fishy, but in any case. So you see, the idea here is that when you go to the lab and you do experiments, sure, if you change something in the brain, something in the mind may change probably. But again, does that mean that brain equals mind? Well, I don't think so. Also realize that you could change something in your mind. Of course, for a materialist, that would mean that you're changing something in your brain, but you could change, you could think differently, you could decide you want to be a bit happier, or you would have a force of will, and then something will change in your brain and in your body, right? So the direction goes both ways, and it's not an equal sign, I would say. Now, yes, the criterion for being dead is not only that you cease to breathe and that your blood stops circulation, but that your brain is off, right? But that's the two-course argument to say, therefore, it is the brain that produces consciousness. Again, we need to be more precise on what we mean by produce. Here, I can mention something that's pretty interesting to me. And William James said it again, and Henri Bergson said it 100 years ago, and Huxley said it, which is that, sure, there's a relationship between brain and consciousness, but what if the brain, instead of having a productive function, constructing, making up consciousness, maybe its function is not to produce, but it's more a selecting function. It's a filter. So I find this idea fascinating. What if the brain, sure, it's very important, but it's not creating it, because I don't see how you could even conceive that matter, which is by definition without mind, can produce mind. But what if matter is filtering the memories and mind and consciousness, right? And this is interesting when you think about inhibition, because, let's go back to the neural correlator and causation. So what's the precise claim? Is the precise claim that more neurons firing, more activity means more mind? Is that the claim of the materialists that like this position? Because sometimes, and this has been shown in recent research on psychedelics, sometimes when you when you have these amazing experiences, and you could claim, I don't know if you ever had mushrooms or ayahuasca or LSD, but you could claim that what's going on in your mind while you're going through that, it's 100-fold more intense and vivid and rich than your normal waking life, right? So, but then you go and measure what's the activity in the lab with fMRI, for instance, or EEG, which are techniques that, in any case, techniques where you can see activity in human brains, and the activity goes down. So again, what's the materialist going to do? It's going to hand wave and say, well, but yeah, it's going down, but in a way, maybe somewhere else it's going up, or this is what's going down, but other things are going up. So you see, one needs to be very careful about what do we mean by this correlation, because there's already some data that doesn't quite fit with this idea. Now, so to recap so far, because I'm telling you many things, sorry if I'm a bit overwhelming with a lot of stuff. Hopefully in the discussion we can, slow down and just, because I'm offering many bits of food, but then maybe we can just taste a few more carefully. But 100 years later, because neuroscience is not so young, right? But it's not so old either. So in 100 years, 150 years, 120 years, really we haven't got further. That's my claim. That's my position. Of course, when you hear in the media, neuroscientists, and I've done it, we need to say, well, we are just like, the best is yet to come, and we know so much, but there's so much yet that we need to know. It's a bit of a zombie rhetoric that we need to use, right? But really, please ask, if you have a neuroscientist friend, especially if it's a devoted materialist, ask him or her, what real insights into the mind has neuroscience produced? Has let's say, neural physiology, cellular physiology, poking neurons or looking at transmitters, you know, what has this really told us about the mind? That is not like what we just discussed, that if you turn something off, it may go off, and if you put it back, it may come back, right? In a way here, being a neuroscientist, I want to be friendly with psychologists, not all of them, but some of them. Like, if you want to know about the mind today, and this is like we say in Spain, throwing stones on our own roof, but it's amazing when people want to know things about the mind. Today, the media call the neuroscientist. Well, I think you should call a psychiatrist or a psychologist, probably, right? So, well, I leave it here. That's going to be on YouTube, so I'm making already enough friends. Okay, so we've gone through a bit of philosophical arguments, a bit of mentioning our own experience. Third, talking about really what's done in the lab, neural correlates, causation. But I want to point two more aspects why I think materialism is not up for the job. And one of them is something that we are not told in universities, and it's not discussed often, which is the history. We are quite oblivious or ignorant about the historical landscape of such position. And in a way, good old-fashioned materialism never dies. They've got away from those metaphysics hidden as empirical claims for forever, like for many, many years. Now it's perhaps getting a bit more sophisticated, but you could call this neo-promissory materialism. Always, you know, kicking the stone a bit further and saying, well, let me promise you medical miracles and revolutionary understanding that's going to be ushered by forthcoming technological innovations. But then you need to wait and say, wait, let's see other promises we've got. And we've got other promises like, you know, again, the DNA is the secret of life. So if you remember, we're going to sequence the whole genome. Once we sequence it, we're going to be able to cure. That's okay. Maybe they didn't say everything, but we're going to be able to cure so many diseases. Some people even said, of course, metaphorically, but some serious editors of serious journals and politicians said, you know, we're going to grow wings on our, literally, we're going to grow wings on our backs if we want. But in any case, we're just going to understand life and we're just going to cure everything. While they sequence it, and of course that allows for more research, but where are those promises? Now, this was done with genetics. Now it's the time for neuroscience. So with the connectome, let's just slice the brain and let's just, you know, measure everything, all the connections and all the molecules. Once we have that, we will cure our mental diseases. We will understand what it means to be us. So you hear this, you know, they're not just fiction writers selling books, which is perfectly great. These are scientists saying, I am my connectome. So what is that? Metaphysics or science, right? So it's kind of the nothing but little cult going around and, you know, let's go back to what I was saying before, verbal testimony of experts. Well, science has become so complex, so complicated, so vast that no one mind can hold it. So if the expert says it, I better believe the expert, right? But let's be careful because there's a lot of what I call promisomics, a lot of promises that are really empty. And really what they just want is that we can continue doing progress, as I'll speak in a moment, but we should ask progress to where, especially looking at the historical record. Now, I'm not against science, of course, I'm a scientist, and I'm not against technology, I'm not a Luddite, right? But you see, yes, science, especially, you know, I'm really enamored of modern physics at the beginning of the 20th century, has blown our minds in our understanding of what's everything, mass, everything physical, mass and energy, you know, space and time, and it has produced amazing toys. Yes, amazing toys. But if we go to life and if we go to mind sciences, those great understanding haven't happened yet, right? So again, we've had the war on cancer, the decade of the brain, the Human Genome Project, the Human Brain Project, and the list goes on, right? So, well, at least let's really, in retrospect, see what happens when we overpromise and then underdeliver. Because maybe society gets fed up with us. It says, "Come on, I mean, we let me put it like joking like this. We used to respect the old man in the white coat, the priest. Then we just move on and respect the old man on the white coat, the scientist. But maybe the time of the scientist will also run out if we make all these promises and we don't deliver. Okay, making more friends. Now, a fifth argument or a fifth point, which is more, if you want, thin and you could even say vague, is an aesthetical one, which is, imagine you don't care about logic. Imagine you don't care about what neuroscientists are doing in the lab. You could even say, and I'll dare to say it as a scientist, but I'm also a person, you could say, I could not care less about the science. There's an aesthetical aspect of embracing materialism versus other isms, right? Which is, you should ask, if you think that the world, the universe is essentially without mind, and that easily leads to thinking that then what are we? Well, maybe we're zombies and we don't have free will. Maybe we're machines, animals are machines, and all of that. Experiences are not real. Love is just an epiphenomenon, blah, 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 blah. So that's your worldview, right? So are we going to take this worldview from the lab back home? Are we going to look at our partner like this? After working with our animals in the lab, are we going to look at our pets, at our cat or dog, or whatever you have at home, like that? So this is of aesthetical importance. Like Whitehead, one of my favorite philosophers too, said, well, it's very simple. As we think, we live, right? So if you think like a materialist, the question is, do you live as a materialist? Now, if the answer is yes, I hope you're happy. And if the answer is no, then there's some incongruence there that we should, or you should revise if you want. Okay, so let me say more things. But at this point, let me pause because I have more things to say, but I just want to know, James, because I haven't been following the chat. Is there something burning? Am I going too fast, too slow? What's the general feedback? Should I continue?
Yes, please continue. I don't know if anyone's got maybe just a quick question for now. Maybe we can take one if there is a question.
I've talked like for 30 minutes, a bit more. I still have easily 20, 25 more minutes.
Sure.
I continue then,
okay.
unless you interrupt me. Okay. Now, in my sweet diatribe against materialism, let me say one more thing. As a physicist turned neuroscientist, but as a physicist, I'm really baffled by what most materialists conceive of matter. So if you're a card-carrying materialist, you say, great, card-carrying materialism. Everything is material, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what is matter then? And you realize two things. One is that they seem to live in the 19th century because their conception of matter dispenses, doesn't want to know anything about the revolutions of modern physics, quantum mechanics, especially quantum mechanics, that space-time relativity, general relativity, special relativity. It's like, well, yes, whatever. Quantum mechanics, these guys that write incomprehensible equations and then have 24,000 different interpretations in any case. But this has shattered the foundations of naive realism and materialism. It has shattered them. But those materialists living in the 21st century seem that it seemed for that the 20th century didn't happen. They say, oh, this doesn't apply in biology or in neuroscience, whatever, doesn't apply. That's one thing. Another thing that's pretty interesting, being a materialist, not all of them, but some of them, easily engage in functionalism. Functionalism is this split between hardware and software. Because functionalists say, well, certain processes, and it doesn't need to be consciousness, it could be other processes like, attention or memory, just solving a problem. You can solve a problem with a tool or with another tool. I can bang something with my phone or with a hand, right? So here you have two hardwares, you could say, two material things that can serve the same function. So then you could say, oh, so maybe those material things are not so important because, in a way, what's really important is the function they can perform. So you see this split. Hardware is important because if you don't have hardware, you cannot carry out the computation, but really what's really important is the software. Now, this split, to me, enacts a bit of Descartes' dualism again. There's mind or spirit on one hand, or algorithm, software, and on the other hand, there's like the fallen flesh, right? So there's the Holy Spirit and the fallen flesh, which is something also very interesting when you look at it. Like many scientists that are materialists, some of them are also, it's like a whole package, reductionists and also atheists most of the time as well. Now, they get all this back, but then even being atheists, they embrace a lot of the theology because science was built in a theological zeitgeist, if you want, right? So we can discuss about this if you want more later. Now, what's going on today is that with this revival I was telling you of new alternative, not new in the sense that they've been there forever, but they just recasted by current philosophers and scientists, given the current context, like panpsychism or idealism, right? So now it's very interesting to see, and you can sense it if you attend a dialogue. And sometimes you don't have a one-on-one directly, but you can sense how materialists get very angry. You know, in a way, if you'll be a psychoanalyst, they'll say there's something in there. There's something in there. I don't know what it is, but why are they getting so angry? They strawman the positions. You know, strawman means you cast the other position in a very cartoonish way. And maybe the materialists say I'm doing that with I hope I'm not with their position, but basically, for instance, in panpsychism, this idea that mind is everywhere or that mind is foundational, is inherent in nature. People say, so you think that a piece of rock, a stone, is having experiences and maybe even talking to you? I mean, come on, that's not serious. That's straw manning it and even getting angry with it. So a take home from this is that pluralism is underrated. Like, why not have different positions, cohabiting the same house of science and philosophy? And sure, we can test them against each other, but it doesn't have to be like winner takes all, at least at the beginning. Okay, now I've told you about materialism. Oh, let's mention enactivism, another ism. Enactivism, the enactive approach. Sometimes, and I think it's fair, the enactivists, and I'm in a way very sympathetic with them too. They say it's not ism, it's an enactive approach. They emphasize not just the brain, but the brain in its body and the body in the world. So for enactivism, the interactions, the relations, the wholes, not just brain parts or the brain itself, are very important, right? Now, this position is tolerated within mainstream because it is heterodox, but it's not heretical, I would say. It's not heretical because, and if there's an enactivist in the room, please tell me, are enactivists materialists or not, right? Because sure, they speak about the embodied mind, I speak about the embodied mind, but at the end of the day, is this magic of brain produces consciousness? No, nobody knows why, but it must be, and yet it should, and yet it does. Sorry, like Chalmers said. So, if we're gonna do the same, but now it's not the brain, but the brain and the body, but then it's the same thing happening. Still, there's a gap there to explain, right? Okay. Yes, let's discuss a bit. This is interesting. Again, too many things, but I want to mention all those points. So I think called, it's fine, a mystic, as I told you, just because I announced on Twitter that I was gonna do this seminar, right? Okay. A mystic. And another intellectual knee-jerk response that classifies people automatically when they critique materialism is that we put forth magic. That's so cool. You know that thing that real magic, the real magic is that which is not real, and that which is not real magic is the only real magic. Well, in any case, so we're mystics, we put forth magic. And then there's another very interesting name that's invoked. It's like a bag of tricks, because in a way this is a dirty fight. You see, at least when you're working, then you go home and you have other problems, the real problems. That's the real problem of consciousness, real life. But another word that's invoked, it's very interesting. I don't know if you've heard of this. Naturalism. So like the materialist said, so maybe what you're saying is, so you're going away from naturalism. What you're saying is supernatural. Do you believe in supernatural entities? Right? Do you believe in ghosts? But you realize this idea of naturalism It smells like physicalism, I was saying before, that says, well, everything in the universe is physical. And then if you ask again, well, why is physics? What does physics really have to say about matter and energy and so on? They'll say, well, whatever it has to say, or it will say in the future. So in a way, naturalism is this kind of big umbrella, or even a Procrustean bed, right? If something doesn't fit in my belief system, I summon the idea of not being naturalistic, and then I cut it. If it doesn't fit, we cut it or we stretch it. Another example is when people say, supernatural, so you believe in the supernatural, and people say also you believe in the paranormal. That's also very funny. It's like, well, what do you mean paranormal? So your thing is the normal, and if I say something that sounds spooky or doesn't fit to you, you call it paranormal, and that's what's called in English a conversation stopper. So it's end of the conversation, because I don't want to even engage in what you have to tell me about whatever phenomena. And I'll mention a few in a moment, like near-death experiences. I had one myself 7 months ago. I almost died, and I had it. You could say something was screwed up in my brain. In any case, I would say from my experience, that's what I saw, and that's what I heard. That's what happened. If I try to push it too much, for a materialist, they'll say, you're talking about supernatural stuff? Are you a mystic? Are you putting forth magic? We don't discuss paranormal stuff here. End of the question, right? So that's what happens. It's a rather kind of colonialist attitude to thinking, because if the phenomena doesn't fall within our domain, there seem to be two options. We say we will either conquer it in the future, or we will exclude it forever, right? There's no real integration. And well, so another interesting word is miracle, right? Note that science only applies to repeatable events, but on the question of miracles, and when the claim that Sagan made popular, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is also a conversation stopper. You mentioned something. You mentioned synchronicity. You're experts here at the Paris Center, right? Synchronicity. It's just coincidence. Yeah, well, it's a very meaningful coincidence. Sure, but what are you talking about? Are you talking about something paranormal? And then if you claim something, well, this is an extraordinary, paranormal, supernatural, right? Extraordinary, and therefore requires extraordinary evidence, which often means, well, like bias theorem. Bias theorem says how you should update your beliefs about one hypothesis in the light of certain evidence. So it's more like, well, you're going to multiply your prior belief by the likelihood of something happening. But many people say, well, the likelihood of what you're saying is very small. And also my belief that this cannot happen is also that this can happen is very small. So end of the question, right? As Oppenheimer said of Bohm, right? Well, if we cannot refute him, let's just ignore him, right? This happens over and over in the history of science. It's very interesting to see how heretics are treated in the history of science. So let's mention the progress argument, because I've mentioned promissory materialism. So the progress argument of materialists, it's filled with what's called filler verbs and killer adjectives. A filler verb is a verb that you use to pretend you know much more than you know. Like, whatever molecule, I make it up. XO35B or gene, X445B, is critical, is critical. Well, that's a killer adjective, critical, fundamental, foundational. And a filler verb would be, well, when we use the word, well, even generates or substrates and so on. So these verbs make it appear as some findings are just more than they are, and we make a lot of progress with those. Like it's virtually infinite. Like physics is complicated and complex and rich, but life and mind is like a jungle. You never end up mapping this creature, how they do things, what neurotransmitters they do, in what ecological niche they live. So forever progress in that sense. But see what Feynman says. So Feynman's injunction for experimenters, quote, I quote, to search more diligently and with the greatest effort in exactly those places where it seems most likely that we can prove our theories wrong. In other words, says Feynman, we are trying to prove ourselves wrong as quickly as possible, because only in that way we may find progress. So compare this with the usual problem, like progress. I would ask, are we trying to prove ourselves as quickly as possible by precisely looking at those corners of phenomena that really have a higher chance to go against what we believe? I contend that promissory materialism is trying to prove itself wrong as slowly as possible, right? Well, so now let's recap a bit. So yes, in a way, it's irresistible. Like here we have the human brain, all brains, but here we have the human brain. And you've heard that sentence, and it's probably true. It's the most amazing, complicated, complex, mysterious piece of matter in the whole universe. Sure, you know, about 90 billion neurons, like, and there are more things than neurons there, right? So in terms of matter, that's incredible. The excitement is understood. But at the same time, we have experience. And what are our most meaningful experiences? As I was saying, well, people rate them, like near-death experience is one of them. Well, for meditators, let's say pure awareness. For psychedelic trips, well, you know. So those experiences, and then compare those with pressing buttons upon artificial questions in the lab. So what experiences should we neuroscientists really study, right? Those that fit our frame, or those that are the most meaningful experiences in the life of people that perhaps, you know, allow us to make us progress as fast as possible. Now, well, you know, that's why we say that if you're not alert and caffeinated, all the rest are altered states of consciousness. That's also funny. So it's not only a rhetorical question. I really don't understand how come materialism hasn't been refuted yet. And perhaps it has been refuted many times, but it still lives, you know, it's like a hydra. Cut its heads, they multiply. And you could understand, I mean, Galileo laid out the foundations of physics, maybe precisely by ignoring mentality in nature as a strategy. Like, let's start, in a way, let's start with the easy. And again, I'm a physicist, but let's start with the easy things, the things we can, and it was hard enough already, you know, we can objectively, you know, measure, and they are inert. So they lend themselves to certain things. But, and then, like, as I was saying, technology brought all these toys, but here we are, centuries later, with these paradoxes. Okay, here I had some paradoxes of materialism, more paradoxes, but I'll skip them. Maybe we'll come back there. Let me just say one thing. Materialism enacts a kind of neurosoteriology. Soteriology is the study of doctrines of salvation. So you realize transhumanism is that. Transhumanism is, to go fast, God is dead, Nietzsche said, but he wasn't, you know, happy. I don't think he was happy about that. He was saying, well, if we kill God, what are we going to replace? So secular humanism replaces God with us humans. And what's the most important attribute? Some humans believe it's the intellect, and with the intellect we build tools. So what does transhumanism say? Well, we don't have priests or God, but we're going to save ourselves, and we're going to achieve immortality. And you see, this is serious. Like, we're going to, you know, put our brains in freezers. It's very difficult to do. And one day, this is promissory materialism, but to the third power, because it's not next decade or next century, maybe in 3 or 4 centuries, we're going to be able to put the brains back in the microwave, wake them up, and by then, probably, we are in paradise again. We can cure cancer, all diseases. So you see, they're promising salvation. We are promising salvation. Some people are buying it. Well, in sum, as I was saying, sure, we have the most puzzling piece of matter on Earth, arguably the human brain. But on the other hand, we have our most precious thing, which is subjective experience, right? Now, there is this clash. What are we going to do with the clash? Are we going to pull the rabbit out of the hat, or are we going to pull the hat out of the rabbit, right? So I promised I wasn't going to promise solutions. So I'll say, let's not rush an answer, and let's not rush a badly posed question either, right? Like, all neuroscientists trying to figure out how brain makes consciousness, because perhaps brain doesn't make consciousness if we're precise about what means. So it has been said before, what I said today, and it will need to be said again, maybe every time in the light of a different context. And just to end, I'll say, well, it's amazing how many things, how many obvious things are not trivial, right? Now, what about, and maybe that can open the discussion. So what about a new science? Or what about the end of science? Or like, can we continue like this forever? And some people, if I can put a metaphor, prefer to rearrange the furniture. Like, we'll build new tools, we'll get more data, and that's enough. Other people like me feel we need to rehabilitate the house of science, not just by cooler furniture, and not only the house walls, if you want, and pipes, but also its philosophical foundations, right? Now, there are alternatives, as I mentioned. It's not just like a totally misty path forward, like I was mentioning at the beginning, contemplative practices, also phenomenology, but it's hard. And there are also some theories of consciousness. I didn't go through them, but I really think integrated information theory has a chance. It has some things that I either don't understand or don't agree with, and we can talk about it also if you're interested. But at least it begins phenomenological. It has phenomenological axioms, so it takes experience seriously. Then it becomes mathematized, but that's perhaps a virtue. So in the end, it's not bad news, but simply I think the solution is not a solution. Maybe it's more like acceptance of where we are and preparation for trying things differently, so that different things can happen. So that's going to sound like a mystic, so I'll say it. And perhaps we can participate in the mystery of consciousness rather than become obsessed with solving the enigma of consciousness. And with this, I'll leave it. I think I've spoken for an hour, but we have one good hour to navigate whatever you want. Yes, thank you for your attention if you're still there.
Great, thank you so much, Alex, for your presentation. It was really refreshing to hear about this problem in a new light. So thank you really much for bringing your ideas forward. Before we open up to everyone, I was wondering if I can see there's Shantina here, the director of the Power Center. I was wondering if maybe Shantina, you had any comments or questions for Alex.
Sure, gladly. Alex, thank you for a really wide panorama you gave us of current theories on consciousness and neuroscience. I still remember our meeting on a beach near Alicante. It was very nice, and it's nice meeting you here again. Well, the question that came to my mind, amongst many that your talk raises, is some people are trying to explain the nature of consciousness with evolutionary argument. And I'm thinking especially of Donald Hoffman in this context, in which like our perception of reality is comparable to icons on a screen in a video game. Doesn't necessarily have to do with how things really are. The icons on a video game have nothing to do with the wires and chips and the electronics that's going on in the computer, but let's say there are efficient ways to navigate reality. I would love you to comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'll say two main things about that. So since you mentioned Hoffman, I wrote a not very charitable review of his book. So if people wanna read what I think about what he wrote, well, there's a piece I wrote that's called "Does Your Brain Exist When Unperceived?" Right? And it wasn't very charitable what I wrote, but I believed what I said. Okay, so I think Hoffman, and Hoffman is, interestingly to me, admired and even quoted by really serious kind of contemplative practitioners and Buddhists. That's well, in any case. I think Hoffman is right in saying perception is not veridical most of the time. You would say maybe never. It's not veridical. We are fooled, and but from there to say that, well, that nothing is really there, it's too much to say. Let's say I have a problem with Hoffman, and Hoffman does something that many of us do. He has a very nice metaphor. Remember the 4 ways of knowing. He has a very nice metaphor, computers and screen and so on. But then, so far so good. But then if you turn your metaphor into a model and then into a metaphysics, it's too quick of jumping, you know? I mean, I think he believes he has a metaphysics because it's conscious realism. But to me, this is not a serious metaphysics, but the analogy is very good. It helps us realize that maybe what we're seeing is not really how things are, right? But then again, this is hardcore philosophy. Now, I don't want to say much more about Hoffman, but your question about the evolutionary argument is a key one. And actually, I had it on my list, and it's very important because that's one of the strongest arguments that materialists make, which is the following. In a way, they could knock down my whole presentation by saying, hey, Alex, do you believe in evolution? Which is always a tricky question, especially if you're in the US, because your answer is, of course, yes, right? But the question is, what evolution are we talking about? Because Darwin perhaps was not so Darwinian. This is a footnote. So they'll say, before you existed, and before animals existed, and before trees existed, before life existed, was there mind? And you need to say, well, unless rocks are conscious, but you need to say, well, it's true. Life, we know, scientific data and inference tell us that life emerged from matter and that mind came with life, right? Therefore, they say, look, so at the Big Bang, there was no mind, so it must have emerged somewhere along the process, right? So this is a very powerful chronological argument. That's how I see it. There was a beginning, chronological beginning, where mind or consciousness was not there, and then we know it is now there. So somehow along the way, it came up, it emerged, and of course, since there was only matter, it must have emerged from matter. But to that chronological argument, there's the phenomenological argument, which is, sure, there was a beginning in time, but the origin, not to conflate beginning with origin, the origin is my consciousness, my experience here now. It is my mind here now that is reflecting on certain data to infer and conclude that before human minds or animal minds, there was maybe no mind, right? So this is a clash between the chronological view and the phenomenological view. And I don't have it solved. To me, the best exponent, the person that explains this the best is Michel Bitbol in France. He has a few books, unfortunately, only the latest ones only in French. And he's a theoretical physicist, actually, that has worked on the foundations of quantum mechanics and lately on Eastern thought and consciousness. But it's an unsolved question. It's a very important one, how to interpret the evolutionary argument. Now, if I can relate it to Bohm, for instance, and the explicate order, like you could imagine that. So how do we imagine evolution? That's what I was saying. There are many ways to invoke evolution, because evolution can be of something that was already involved and that's unrolling. But maybe mind was already enfolded, and then this obvious chronological unfolding already contained it. It's a very interesting point. And yes, I don't have it solved. Actually, I would like to learn more about how these two positions clash. In France, there's this movement, well, not in France, but we'll check globally, it's called speculative realism. And these guys are pushing hard of this idea that, the fossil records tell you at some point there was no mind, therefore mind has to be secondary. But phenomenology always fights back.
Thank you, Alex.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Antina, for coming in on this. Yes, now we can open it up to everyone. If you've got a question or a comment to make, you can use the raise your hand function, which can be found under reactions at the bottom of your screen. Physically raise your hand or write your question in the chat and I can read it out for you. So who wants to go first? Pam.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm absolutely petrified. This is the first time I've ever spoken on any of these. But Alex, that's an amazing talk you just gave. I'm just an artist, but I have been extraordinarily interested in David Bowman's work for a long time. What you were saying about Bohm's explication, if you like, of consciousness, I do think that this is true. I think it's woven through the implicate order at some wonderful level, maybe the super implicate level, I don't know. And perhaps at certain stages of our own development, perhaps through meditation, you might want to say something about that to me too. When you stop thinking altogether and you reach a certain state where there isn't anything, but there is still something. Is that what you're getting at? Because that's it's sort of where it leads me. And a lot of the things that have happened to me come from no background whatsoever. I'm just sort of pulled towards them because I smell their truth. So I'd love you to comment on that maybe. And also on the Bohm Krishnamurti, if you have, I'm sure, read them, The Limits of Thought. Because when there isn't any thought, what is there? Thanks, Alex.
You're very welcome. Okay, let's see. If I forget something, there are a few threads here. So, well, I'm not an expert in Bohm, so perhaps somebody else could comment after me, maybe to clarify that point. But as Terence McKenna would say, if the artists cannot find a way, then nobody can find a way. So when you're saying I'm just an artist, well, speculating a bit, which is the part that I curiously didn't say at the end, maybe because I didn't want to make it longer, but how do we go forward from here? You know, the end of my talk was more like, well, we continue doing more of the same or do something new as a scientist? And I asked this myself, how is the future scientist going to look in the future? Well, I think it's going to look also like an artist. I really believe that. And for instance, this idea of the contemplative practices, which are practices, they're not theories. It's something you need to do, right? So I always say, joking but seriously, like to doctoral students in neuroscience, they give them all these courses they must have, right? On neurotransmitters, cellular physiology. Well, part of the neuroscience program, maybe in 50 years, should be some psychedelics. I mean, it should be actually experiencing your own mind differently than just some smoking, just some coffee, and just some alcohol, right? And what do I mean by that? This is not an incitation to take drugs, quote unquote. It's more like, as I see, as a mystic now, and speculating about the future, and we scientists would need to become the tools of observation of our own minds. And that's painful because that requires transformation. The Paris Center is for transformation. It's a big word. What does it mean to transform, right? It means, what is it? To change some habits, to give some clever lectures, to feel happy when you go. It's much more than that, right? So I think, for instance, the Buddhists and also the artists, they themselves embody those tools, right? That's why I'm saying that perhaps the future of the scientist is to become more like an artist and transform yourself. And then to begin with, be able to have a much more richer experiential vocabulary, not vocabulary in terms of naming it, but sense of the different states of mind. And that's what I would say. I don't know if there's something else missing from because your question was really rich in terms of how I see the future, transforming ourselves. These are big words, and these are big words. Let me add one more thing. These are big words today, where science is a job, right? You know, my parents, I think my dad is here, but my parents always are very proud of me, of course, like, he's a scientist, you know, scientists are so clever. Well, it's a profession. I mean, we are all not so clever. It's a job. Before it was a matter of amateurs, and that had its problems. Only the very rich, usually men, could be scientists. Now it's a job, and you don't want to, you have mortgages to pay. So, you know, it's from that to the very serious commitment of, no, I'm going to be the tool, I'm going to transform yourself. It sounds very mystic, indeed.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Pam, for coming in, and welcome to your first question. Who else would like to come in? Again, you can write in the chat your question if it makes you feel more comfortable. Anyone?
I'll ask a question.
Go on, David.
Thank you very much for a very thorough consideration of the mystery of consciousness. And I was wondering, Professor Gomez-Marin, whether you would have you considered the Whiteheadian view of that sentience, the capacity for experience or the capacity to be aware is in fact universal, and have you given any thought to that? It has some merit, in my opinion.
Thank you, David. Yes, I have. I would consider myself a Whiteheadian, although I don't think most Whiteheadians really understand Whitehead because it's so difficult. But yes, and another way of saying panpsychism is what Whitehead calls pan-experientialism, right? And yes, as like the metaphor of the magnet I was putting, right? Whitehead says his cosmology, right, is that everything has a physical and a mental pole, two poles, and this I would say helps in not coming across this kind of dead end of how do we pull mind out of matter. And Whitehead is much more complex and rich. I mean, he has a whole, let me just say, because I'm not going to be able to summarize Whitehead, but let me just say, well, Whitehead was a mathematician, right? He wrote Principia Mathematica with Russell. And then when he was about to retire, let me just say a biographical fact. When he was about to retire, they offered him a job in the US, and he was in England, right? And he was in the UK, and he about retire. He was already he had transitioned from mathematics to philosophy of science, and then at retirement he went to the US and wrote hardcore cosmology. So it's not just philosophy of science or physics or philosophy or metaphysics. It's a whole a whole scheme for everything in the universe, and has something that's amazing. So Whitehead first would say the ultimate principle is creativity. This is beautiful. It's a creative universe, right? And Whitehead is very sympathetic. Well, they wrote each other with Henri Bergson, right? So there are these amazing people: William James, Henri Bergson, Alfred North Whitehead. All these, not just incredible minds, because I was saying at the beginning, there's many intelligent people saying very stupid things, but these guys were true geniuses, right? And sure, sometimes now the revival of panpsychism today, led by Philip Goff, I think they want to draw more from Russell's version of panpsychism, but there you can dig. That's just to say, it sounds very technical, sorry for the audience, but you can dig to other like really towering intellects that propose these very same ideas with different sensibilities. And Whitehead is one of them. Yeah, yes, exactly.
Thank you, David, for coming in. So there's been quite a discussion. There's been a discussion in the chat. So I was wondering if maybe someone wanted to come in and basically summarize a bit what's been going on. Suzanne, I believe, wanted to maybe come in. Oh, you're unmuted, but we can't hear you for some reason.
That do it?
That will do it, yes.
Okay. So we're discussing the idea of whether one is an abstract or concrete thinker and how that people can change. My knowledge is that we both have the ability for both right brain and left brain thinking to use that terminology, and that the concrete and the abstract are available to all of us. Some people might favor one more than the other, but it doesn't mean it's not available.
Yes. Well, thank you for that comment, and it ties with the previous comment, because Whitehead famously put forth what he called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Before, it was fashionable to call things fallacy of. Now it's not so fashionable anymore. What does Whitehead mean by misplaced concreteness? Is when you take something that's abstract as if it was concrete reality. And this is, I think, this fallacy is happening over and over in consciousness studies. Why? Because we can make great abstractions, and they are powerful, about all these isms or about computations in the brain, information, and so on. These are abstractions, but what about concrete reality? And then we make this sleight of hand where we say, well, all of those abstractions, now let me just swap them as if they were my concrete reality. So just a way to illustrate this, which is very puzzling, is you would ask, what's more real, an atom or your pain or your tooth pain, right? And incredibly enough, many would say the atom is more real, you know? And I'm not saying atoms don't exist, but they're in a way affordances, using Gibson's language. We build those through, I mean, our theories build machines that are able to peep into these worlds, right? But they are, at the end of the day, abstractions, right? You could say very real abstractions, but not concrete like my pain. So thank you for your comment, because another tension that I think needs to be talked about and resolved is this tension between the abstract and the concrete. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Suzanne, for coming in, and thank you for everyone who's been contributing in the chat. Keep it going. Next, we will go to I believe Paul. Did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. Am I hearable?
I can hear you. Yes.
I will just be brief. I'm overwhelmed at everything that has gone on because it is so rich in every way. My only comment was I perked up when Whitehead was mentioned. I've tried to plumb Whitehead, and he's very difficult to understand. However, if I reduce him to a simple sentence, I'm happy with that sentence. And it is this: we are not, as human beings, we are not things, we are a process. And I can't, it's possible to go somewhere from there, but I'm not capable of doing that. That's all I want to say.
Yes, maybe this is related to, is it Bohm's Rio mode, right? That's Bohm's Rio mode, right? I mean, maybe Whitehead is difficult to understand, and that's our fault, because he's really trying to, if you want to substitute substance metaphysics with process metaphysics, if you really believe that the universe is not made of substances, kind of static things, but more like processual things, it's an oxymoron, but anyways, and then you need to change your language, and maybe that's why his cosmology is so difficult, and that's why these attempts, like Bohm's attempt of the Rio mode, are so weird, because it's literally, and more than that, it's like learning another language. But it's more than another language. Let me use a computer metaphor here. You're changing the operating system, right? So you're used to your Microsoft computer for your whole life, and now you need to use something completely different, and you don't even know how to click where's the Zoom link, or where's the bin, so it's very challenging, I think, because of that. And let me just add, I think Eastern thought is more prone to that. I don't speak, Chinese or anything like that, but Eastern thought is more prone, the operating system is more prone to process. And maybe that's why some of those amazing Western philosophers ended up drawing from, the great knowledge of Vedanta and so on, the I Ching, of course, and so on and so forth, because that's their operating system. So I think they have an easier time than us.
Well, thank you for that. And next we will go to Rafael.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Okay, I have two questions. One question is why we don't give the materialist point of view the consciousness that they ask for, because there is some kind of consciousness, I would say, or if we call it expert systems or robotic or anything related to artificial intelligence, that we call it artificial intelligence, but why we don't give that, consider that as a consciousness, but it's a limited form of consciousness, and which is going to increase, that is increasing, and has several characteristics of a non-physical consciousness, if you want, which is engaging with the environment, learning, and so forth. Why don't just allow that within the scientific conventional world, a consciousness that is just limited consciousness? And my second question is, if there is a non-physical consciousness, what is the purpose? What is the function? What is the purpose of that non-physical consciousness? That's two questions.
So the second one, if I understood it correctly, is very hard. We'll come back to it in a moment. But I'm not sure I understood the first one. You're asking about artificial intelligence in particular, and why not giving AI the benefit of the doubt, like saying, well, let's assume
no,
that's
why
also
don't you
conscious.
call it that consciousness as like Bond and Kay call a limited consciousness with content? So it's a material. So why have a material consciousness and a non-material consciousness?
Well, here's where one would need to go back to definitions, and that's always tiresome but important. Like I don't even think that computers think, they calculate to begin with, but then we will need to say whether we're talking about consciousness in machines, and you want to qualify it by saying it's whatever, inert, I don't know what term you use, but then we have consciousness, then we could speak about mind. Within mind, there are many types of mind, then there is intelligence. All those things are not the same, right? So maybe machines are intelligent, but again, even that could be questionable, that artificial intelligence is really intelligent. So
Yeah,
I would,
as a limited form of course, they are not as the big intelligence. They are not the more deep, free, creative intelligence. But why we don't call it? And then there is no conflict. Too much conflict in this conflict between the people.
We have to think that we don't call it that because we have to think very carefully of what that would, to begin with, what that would entail, right? Because if by decree we decide that machines are consciousness, just limited in consciousness, then we're saying that there is something it feels like for this thing to be an iPhone, right? And therefore, when it's broken, what do? Do I bury it? I mean, we cannot just postulate these things are conscious. And it has huge implications, so we should be very careful. Now, how do we do it? Maybe you're right, and they are limited in consciousness, but for that we need theories. And maybe that helps me bring back integrated information theory. At least that theory makes very specific predictions and non-trivial about what structures in the world could score for consciousness as it's defined by integrated information, and which ones would not. So at least we have a principled way of assessing whether this thing would be and would or would not be. And I think IIT says an iPhone is not conscious, but it doesn't close the door for machines to be conscious in the future. That depends how we build them. At least with a theory, we could say. Otherwise, it's a bit like, well, what everybody believes. And it's, again, if we were wrong about that, it has huge implications the moment there's law for machines to be treated better. Let me just say one more provocative thing. I was saying many scientists don't believe plants are not even conscious, like even with mind, but they're so happy to entertain that machines have. This is amazing. It's like people debating the rights of machines while we still haven't really figured out the rights of animals, right? I mean, activists would love my comment. I don't want to be, I mean, pro one side or the other, but how amazing it is that we sometimes care more about machines than about octopus or cats or mice, you see? It's interesting ethically why we have this inclination.
One more thing, first question. So my understanding is that, for example, Krishnamurti defined consciousness as whatever is content. The consciousness is what the content is defined by the content. So, and also it's in the brain. So it's a materialistic consciousness. So he defined consciousness as we know in a materialistic term. Of course, he proposed that if we break through that, we will connect to a non-materialistic consciousness. But do you think that Krishnamurti is wrong calling our current consciousness a materialistic consciousness based on content?
I would not know what to answer because I don't know Krishnamurti enough, and probably he would be right. And if he was here in the Zoom, he would just unmount anything I say because he does that really, really well. Let me just add something, which is, I'm sorry, I'm not replying to this, but mentioning Krishnamurti reminded me of a previous question where he was mentioned. And this is more my shortcoming. Because in my survey of what could help bring science forward, especially the science of consciousness, I already mentioned a few times contemplative practices. But I have a feeling I want to share with you. You know what you think, but I'm talking about operating systems and the West and the East. I mean, Krishnamurti or even the Dalai Lama, they have patience for us Westerners. I was going to say Europeans, but let's say Americans too. Like, because I feel, yes, we mindfulness has been embraced by our culture, but it's really Buddhist for dummies, I would say. I mean, that's my feeling. Like, because they are so professional, they go to such states, and what do we do with it? Well, it's like a relaxation exercise Tuesdays and Thursdays from 7 to 8. You know, it's like it really, really falls short. And I don't know. The bar is so high to practice that properly. Maybe I have a friend who says that he likes to think of gods as local gods. So maybe that's not our local God. We should not import it because I'm not sure if we're able to. So, well, I'm just speaking aloud in my confusion because we have the Western tradition of philosophy, but then when we bring these amazing ways of understanding that come from the East, we look at them like exotic birds, but I'm not sure we ever really understand really what that is about. But again, I'm talking from my ignorance and inability to fully grasp.
Question. Second question is, what would be the function of a non-physical consciousness?
Well, here the two big problems. One is, well, not problems, like the question of what function does could consciousnness have? Right?
If there is one.
Yes, that's one. And the other one is what it would mean to what do you mean by a non-physical consciousness? I cannot reply because I don't really understand what you mean by non-physical consciousness.
Not in the brain. I mean, or beyond the physical reality that we know. I mean, you were talking about a little bit about that, but so because the point about finding a consciousness that is beyond the brain is to see what it does, to a certain extent, to understand what is beyond our physical reality is to also to ask for what is the meaning of that, what is the function, how that fit into our physical reality and our life in general.
Oh, your questions are really not only confusing, they're hard. Yeah. What can I add? Well, I can say, of course, some neuroscientists argue that consciousness is not intelligence, but that consciousness helps in evolution. So if you're like a standard evolutionary view, it would make sense that consciousness emerged if that's what happened, right? Because, well, if you're conscious, you could better navigate the world. So that would be a kind of an easy, direct answer. It's not contradictory. It would make sense, and so it would have a function. But per se, you could also imagine a universe where nothing is conscious, and still, animals are little robots that manage to avoid dangers and so on. And there's nothing. It feels like for that bacterium or for that fish to be like a fish or a bacterium, right? So you could still disentangle the function of consciousness from consciousness itself. Again, back to Whitehead and Bergson. I like this idea of the creative universe. It sounds very theological, but maybe it's, mind in its own recreation, having fun in a way, to put it in a very American way. Let's just have some fun. Maybe it's mind deciding it's going to forget about itself and have some fun and be creative. And that's a beautiful, going back to the aesthetics and the artist, that's a beautiful picture of the universe. Maybe it's wrong, but it's a beautiful, like Bergson says it all the time, there's continuous creation. And Whitehead says it all the time, advance into novelty, right? And that's fabulous. You would say, well, you're deluding yourself. But if I had to choose, I prefer a universe like that, but not a stupid, cold, automatic and zombie universe for no reason, right? That only some scientists with some computer simulation will be able to understand.
Thank you, Raphael, anyway, for your contributions. We should really move on, just give everyone the opportunity, but thank you for coming in. We'll go next to Hande. I apologize if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry, because I am, my name is Hande. It's, I was listening to this conversation. My mind is now so in that conversation. But my question, first of all, I'm feeling everyone, so I'm feeling very nervous. I have super nervousness right now, feeling like all these minds, great minds, they are so smart. Oh, what the fuck? I'm so, like I'm not deprecating myself, but I'm in that space, and at the same time, I'm so happy to be, I'm almost going to cry, to be part of this community, because so I listened to your presentation. My question is about my experiences, and I'm still nervous. Why I'm nervous? So I usually say I'm no one when I introduce myself. I'm no one, because it gives me some sort of emptiness. So I want to ask you the question about emptiness and transformation, because I'm also a very physical person. I do a lot of activities and I lose myself in the activities, and then it takes me to a transformation, I mean, physically and mentally. So I am not a scientist like objective science. I studied economics. I'm a PhD in economics, whatever that means to all of you. But I had really hard time when I worked on methods and methodologies in economics. So that brought me to try to educate myself through, in 2005, listening to Buddhists and neuroscientists in Stanford University. There was like these conversations started. I don't know if anyone. So then I started to educate myself. Anyways, so I'm just an amateur, but emptiness and transformation, anything about that? Does it make sense?
Yes. Unfortunately, my answer to emptiness is going to be rather empty, because I don't really know what to say about it. I can say more about transformation, but yeah, the vacuity, is this an English word? These things coming from Sankhya, right? I don't know those things well. Not only don't I know them intellectually, but I haven't practiced them. It's in my list. So I cannot say much about it. I can say something about transformation. But before that, you say you're making this axis of clever, stupid. But there's a way I like to rephrase what science should be about, which is about higher quality ignorance. Somebody said it, I don't remember who said it, but it's nice to think about that. It's not about whether we're very clever or very stupid. It's about whether our ignorance is of a higher quality. So maybe we're more aware of what we don't know and why we don't know it, and what it would mean to know it, and why what we think we know perhaps it doesn't make any sense at all. So it's humbling to think of science as higher quality ignorance rather than headlines. Blah 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 discovered, scientists or experts say, and because we tend to be very focused on certainties and control and manipulation. That makes sense for a practical mind. But if we're talking about the other mind, well, maybe realizing that we don't really understand what is going on. It's not only fun, but maybe even healing. and for transformation, in the West, again, I'm sorry for making this divide. You know what we have in the West, but in the East, they have mantra, right? They have mantra, respect. I would say respect the mantra. I've been in India a few times, and I mean, of course, you can do so exotic things again as a Westerner in India, but to me, something very powerful is this idea, which is not an idea, it's more than an idea, that through sound, there's something that can be transformed in you. Now, if my materialist friends have made it all the way through this point in the conversation, they have great tweets to post about me, right? But we are very, very visual, right? And reading and programming. But there's something, that's something I learned in India, that's beautiful and powerful, that there's some things that the eye cannot grasp, but only the ear. And I've experienced mantra. I haven't experienced vacuity or emptiness, but I've experienced mantra, and it does something to you. It does something to you, and to a Western intellect, it seems rather paranormal, supernatural, right? What is this doing? It's old wisdom. So I just mention it in respect.
Well, thank you so much, Hande, for coming in. It's very great to have you, and thank you for contributing. Next, we'll go to Michael.
Hi, everyone. Hey, Alex, thanks so much. This is fascinating because you're bringing up so many questions, which I always enjoy more than the answers. One of the reasons why I chimed in earlier was because for me, what tends to help is with, I think it was Hande's question about artificial intelligence versus, say, like human intelligence or intelligence of nature, would be, in ancient Greek, there's the difference between techne and physis, something that's built, which might be an impression of nature, instead of like and I'm interpolating, but a living natural process, where there aren't necessarily strong delineations between forms. And for me, the question that I play with the consciousness, and there's some old ideas in like Western alchemy that seem to line up sometimes in Eastern thought, is what if everything's tied together through time? And if time may be primary before even matter or space, which there's a German philosopher, Hans Reichenbach, where he does some interesting math where he posits the question of, and you can see it in the symmetry with some of the equations, where is this all emerging out of time, and are things bubbling out that way? So does that map onto any of your models or anything that you've explored? Like, I'm really curious, like, where does this kind of dovetail? And as far as the Eastern perspective, like, I've had some interesting experiences from like yoga, meditation, martial arts, and it's usually a dropping away. So it does kind of tie in with this idea of emptiness, but that the emptiness, kind of like Bohm, is fullness, or like a plenum of potential.
Well, it's like, it feels like now after more than like nearly 2 hours, we're in a realm of not even questions like koans even. Yes. Well, I just react to it, not even dare to say I'll reply or respond. With something less elevated, but that's what comes to mind. Three things come to mind. One is a philosopher that I really like. It's called Canguilhem. It's a French one, and because you're speaking about machines and nature, right? And yeah. I think he traces back he's a historian of biology, but also of medicine, but also a philosopher. And he reminded me something that can be a trick again. So I'm always wary about tricks we play ourselves, you know? So there were horses, and then we built trains and cars. And we built trains and cars in the image of the horse, you could say. But then we make, again, the sleight of hand, and then we say, therefore horses are cars and trains, just natural ones. But we were more, what was the original, what was the copy, what was the inspiration, right? And that easily lends to mechanicism and reductionism, like, because you think that now a horse or a dog is just a natural machine, which is a weird thought to me. And in neuroscience it happened the same. There's a very nice book called The Idea of the Brain by Matthew Cobb, that explains the history of neuroscience. And in the middle of the last century, explains how the pioneers were modeling computers with the brain as an image. It's like, well, that's the model and you're painting, right? But then again, the thing happened, the thing switches, and now we think that it's brains that are like computers, right? So metaphors can be also dangerous if we allow that switch. It's not equivalent. So that's one thing that comes to mind mentioning techne and physics. And another thing is this other book. Sorry for the references here, but these are like treasures, so I want to share them with you. The Veil of Isis is called the book. The Veil of Isis, and I forgot the author. Who's Hadot? I think it's Hadot, and he delineates two types of scientists, and one is the Promethean one, you know, the one that wants to steal the tricks from the gods, and that's more or less where science has been built upon in the last 400 years. Francis Bacon and so on. Like, we're gonna interrogate nature from outside. We are like interrogators, right? We're gonna literally. I think the quote is, we're gonna make her speak all of her secrets, right? And then contrast this view with the other type of scientists, and maybe both need to go in parallel, where you're not interrogating nature. It's more romantic. You're seducing her, and she's seducing you, and you're trying to get her to whisper some secrets, right? So, well, this also articulates a tension between the natural and the technical. I mean, we can be, and we'll probably be, very sophisticated technically, but still we could have a more romantic approach to nature in that sense, where we don't treat it as the machines we built to study, but we still ask for a conversation rather than interrogation.
Yeah. And my original background is mechanical engineering. So, but I have this also background in martial arts and movement. So it's fascinating, especially in like a Filipino martial art where it's focused on rhythm and movement and flow and not just individual techniques. And it seems to me that they're qualitatively different. And the idea of technique and feces, for me, is really helped separate and really ask, well, is this something composed of parts instead of something that is a whole and possibly grown? And that feels to me different, even though there could be sides of the same coin. And yeah, and more going back to nature and seeing what she has to reveal. What else can I learn?
And let me add, so you say you're a martial artist, and you are an artist like the previous artist, because movement is often an embodiment, is taken for granted. Like, look what happened when, with all this development of machines and artificial intelligence, somebody picked the pinnacle of human intelligence, like chess and Go. But why not dancers and martial artists? Like, and it's amazing that we can the machines can be the world expert in Go, and even have hints of creative movements, right, with AlphaGo. But what about embodied robots? What about dancing tango? What about the things that are really in the flesh and martial arts? I mean, people say it's just violence, but I respect it tremendously. Martial arts. Yeah, it's a form. It's you could even say it's an elevated form of mind.
I've worked some things in the last few months with a friend who's also, she's a social worker. So she's got a psychology background, and some of the patterns, and you can see her intellect trying to assert itself, like the parsing. It's what I refer to the intellect, the sequential. And it's like, no, let go, just feel. Like, go by rhythm, go by feel. And it's so funny because it's almost like we're so trained that the intellect says, no, you need me, even though everything is going just fine and you're going way faster. So it's not better or worse, but it's accessing almost a different realm of experience. Like,
When I was in Lisbon doing my postdoctoral research, I was in a project with artists, and I worked for many months with a dancer. And it was fascinating to work with her. And I even wrote a piece in English. You can Google it. It's called something like 10 Simple Things I Learned from a Dancer About, I don't know about what. And yes, I would engage in conversation. And she said, no, I just need to try this. You just need to try this. And it's like, come on, stop. Basically, she was saying, stop, burning my head with your stupid ideas. Get up and do it, I learned so much.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for your contributions. And I'm really glad that you've enjoyed this session and Alex's presentation. We'll take the last question from Brenda, who's had her hand up for a while now.
Oh, hello from Dublin, and thank you for this most stimulating talk, Alex. I just really have a couple of questions, and some of which you've just covered there in your last comments. But first of all, to your critique of neuroscience, I would suggest, as probably a lot of people know, that it relates to this strongly held belief that science, rather than any other form of human expression, is the road to absolute truth. And of course, some of us know that that is not actually the case. From my own personal experience of training in the sciences as a medical doctor, but also in the humanities as an art historian, I can say after 20 years experience in both disciplines that I've learned more from the latter about consciousness than the former. And further and lastly, I'd just like to say that I agree entirely with you that we should look beyond neuroscience, or neuroscience should look beyond neuroscience to look at psychologists and what they are contributing to insights into the mind. But I would add, and you related it there yourself, I completely agree with you, artists should be included as a very valuable resource for understanding, because they work extraordinarily hard. And we already had a very well-established artist on speaking earlier, who, by the way, I happen to know is also a dancer. So I think we should be, scientists should look to artists. And Alex, you are the epitome of the right kind of scientist, because you are looking beyond the limitations of science itself. So thank you.
Wow, thank you. Well, let me say, back to the quote on what you can do for your country, not your country for you. I also work with magicians. There's a project in the lab we have. We work with machine, especially with a few, but a very good one, a professional one, called Miguel Angel Gea from Spain. And working with an artist, we try not to fall prey to this habit of, okay, I'm gonna explain to him why his tricks cognitively work, why they can fool us, and we turn it the other way around. So it's like, how can they help us better understand how the mind works, right? So this is a very concrete example of a simple switch. Instead of, I'm going to explain the magic of the magician, no, the magician is going to be a tool that's going to help me understand better my own thing, so I can learn from them. And that always happens with artists, if they're willing, and we're willing. Now, to end, maybe, because that's really perhaps the last comment we're going to make, on a more positive tone, I don't know if I sounded bitter. I used to sound bitter, but I went from, I'm working on my cynicism, that has helped me, but into more irony, right? And to be more positive. Otherwise, I'm always like complaining to those who don't want to listen to me, or preaching to the choir, right? And so, to end on a positive note, sure, I think, and I've written this somewhere, that you can learn more from literature than from any neuroscience treatise, how I said in English. If you name the Brothers Karamazov or whatever, like big piece of novel, you learn more about the human mind than in any book of neuroscience, right? But having said that, let me just say something in favor of the neuroscientists, which is we are in a privileged position. It's not the only one, but we have this gift that it turns out that we're studying this thing, which is the brain, which is truly fascinating. So it is a gift, right? So let me put it this way. My critique is so that this gift is not wasted in hubris and stupidness, and scientism, which is what you were referring to. This idea that, okay, everybody get out, psychologists get out, artists get out, priests, theologians get out, even philosophers get out, and we are going to solve it alone because we're scientists and we really know. I mean, many scientists don't really think like that, really, if you ask them. But unfortunately, sometimes it seems we need to act like that. So it's still a mystery. There's this thing, it's called the brain. And it really plays a big role in this thing we call consciousness, right? The question is whether we can make, let me put it this way, like I was speaking about the veil of Isis and how we ask or have a conversation with nature, Let's improve our way of conversation, dialogue, right? How can we have a very good dialogue with nature, with ourselves, with our own minds? And maybe that ties with gentle action of Pete, right? To refer to him too. And then we're all invited. Then it's a job for everybody to be able to have this conversation in a more sophisticated and also joyful, because otherwise everything is so heavy, everything's so difficult and so complicated, but also more joyful. Bergson, let me end with Bergson. Bergson says that the mark that life has triumphed is when joy is there. That's a good symptom, right? If there's no joy, something, of course we have pains and troubles, but if there's no joy, something doesn't smell good, right? So let's end on a positive note, despite my cynicism / irony.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brenda, for contributing. So we're on the hour, unfortunately, so I guess we should start closing. Alex, do you have any final remarks to give us before we close?
Spoken so much. Oh, thank you. Thank you. We've made it to 2 hours and you're still there, like 60 people. Some Zooms, you see it falling. It's like, okay, do something or it's going to be only you. You're still there. Thank you for your attention in the economy attention. 2 hours, 60 people. It's great. It's great and it works. It works. It seems Zoom works sometimes. That would have been impossible 2 years ago. So yeah, I'm grateful. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Alex. And yes, as you said, it works sometimes, but it'd be in person, it would be better. So I hope you'll be able to come to Pari and do something there. So yes, thank you so much, Alex. It's really been an incredible session. You've created such a very inclusive space. So thank you so much for this. And thank you all for joining us. It's been, your questions really made the second part. So really thank you all.
Yes.
Just before we go, I just got a couple of announcements, a few housekeeping things from the Pari Center. The first thing is I hope to see you. You're all invited to our next free event here at the Pari Center, which will be on the 18th of November, where we'll have the musician and researcher Donna Coleman, who will be talking to us about color and key, emotional responses to music tonality. So it'll be at the same time as now, so I really hope you'll join us then. I'd also like to invite you all to support us by becoming a friend of the Pari Center, which is our membership program. By becoming a member, you will get a 10% discount on all of our programs, online and in person, receive our journal 4 times a year, or the next issue will come out in December, and it will be on consciousness. I invite you all to do that. It'll cost €30 a year, and you get all these benefits. And also, I'd just like to announce, we're all very excited about this, that we are planning our in-person programs again here at the Pari Center for next year. We'll be shortly announcing these. There's still some discussion. We're announcing dates, guests, titles for all of our events. So just keep your eye open on our newsletter and website. And yes, finally, any questions, please do contact us on our website, social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or just email us, james@paricenter.com to contact me, or Eleanor@paricenter.com to contact Eleanor. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you so much, Alex. And we'll see you again soon here at the Pari Center. Bye-bye.
Ciao. Thank you.